back in 2012, I decided I was going to run 100 miles. It was a scary big goal. And I've talked about this in some of my videos. So some of you may already have heard parts of this story, but there's something that I never talked about before because it felt wrong to mention. Like if I said it out loud, people would think I just lost my mind, right? And honestly, maybe I did. But I've been thinking about this for a hot second, and I think I want to talk more about this. When I signed up for the Pine to Palm 100 back in 2012, I wasn't new to ultramarathons. I'd already run handfuls of 50Ks, and I qualified with 100K. And I had this training method that worked for me, right? It was unconventional, though, for the time. So 4 days a week, I was doing serious strength training, like heavy deadlifts and squats, pushing prowlers, pulling sleds loaded with heavy plates. And the other 3 days of the week, I was doing short, intense speed work, like hill sprints, Tabata intervals, but none of the runs that I ever did were ever more than 90 minutes long. But I had proven that this training worked for me. And then Mother's Day came, and I spent the day up in Tahoe running at high elevation with friends, and it was a beautiful day. It was exactly what I needed, and I stressed my Achilles. So here I was, injured, right? Having to cut out running entirely from my training and switch to rowing instead for my conditioning. And people told me that I wasn't going to finish, right? A lot of people told me that. You need those long miles, right? You need the distance on your feet. I get it. You can't do 100 miler this way. And they weren't wrong, but I always like to experiment for science. So I had something else up my sleeve. And it was a little out there. It was very much Krista, right? So every morning, an hour before my kids woke up, I would go into my office and I would put on my headphones. I would play this shamanic drumming in the background. I would lay down on the floor and I would do this visualization where I would be picturing myself running through the Siskiyou Mountains of Oregon toward the finish line. But in the beginning, I couldn't actually visualize myself crossing the finish line. The doubt was too strong, right? And here's where this gets kind of brutal. So if you have sensitivities to violence, fast forward or click off. I'll totally understand. But here's the thing. When that doubt showed up, and it always did, I would visualize that version of me, the version that didn't believe she could finish. And I had this other version of myself who would run up from behind her, tackle her to the ground, and basically kick and beat her into oblivion. I know, that sounds really, really violent. And I'm not a violent person by nature at all. So this was completely odd to me. But in my mind, that version of me was all doubt. And I felt compelled to physically confront that doubt head on. I was telling myself I had to believe that I would overcome her. And I did this 3 days a week for almost an entire year. And here's why that fascinates me. On race day, there was no doubt. I knew I was going to finish. Even after I had serious IT band issues around mile 40, lost all the skin on my heels by mile 50, and was told I had missed the time cutoff at mile 65, Dutchman Peak. But I could continue, they told me, because I looked stronger than the last 10 guys that came through the aid station. But I believed I would finish because I spent a year doing something I didn't fully quite understand. I had spent a year in ritual, repeatedly enacting the identity of someone who could run 100 miles over and over until my brain believed it. I didn't call it a ritual back then, but looking back, that's exactly what it was. So I recently started exploring this idea of ritual. And what I found was that ritual isn't necessarily something religious or ceremonial. It's not about incense or candles or chanting, though it can be, right? You can integrate those things into it. But a ritual is something you do repeatedly and intentionally that carries meaning beyond the action itself. And it could be something as mundane as the coffee you make the same way every morning, or the pattern of how you start or end your day. But then I was thinking, well, what's the difference between ritual and habit? And what I found in my research is that the key difference is this. A habit is something you do because it produces a practical result. It doesn't necessarily have meaning attached to it or any sense of identity woven into it. You brush your teeth because your teeth need brushing, right? But a ritual carries meaning. You make a cup of tea or a cocktail every evening, not because you're thirsty, but because the act of making it signals that the workday is over. It marks a transition. Many of us have these rituals, right? And what I was doing in my office, lying on the floor, it was repetition with meaning, with purpose. And that turned out to be an important distinction, right? That wasn't just a habit. So I was curious, did repeating that visualization over and over actually change what I believed about myself? And if it did, how did that even work, right? So that led me to a researcher named Nicholas Hobson at the University of Toronto who studied rituals and brain responses using EEG, which measures electrical activity in the brain. And he looked at what happens to your brain's error signal when you make a mistake after you've been performing a ritual. And what he found was that the people who had been practicing a ritual prior to completing a task still made mistakes, but the brain's response to those mistakes was reduced. It's almost as if the error, even though it registered, it carried less weight. The ritual was creating a buffer. And I think that's part of what was happening to me on that floor. I wasn't eliminating doubt in the beginning, right? I was practicing a response to it over and over. But that still didn't fully explain what happened to me because my doubt didn't just get quieter, right? On race day, it disappeared. So I went back into looking into this and I found two other pieces of information that were interesting. Albert Bandura, a Stanford psychologist, spent decades studying what actually builds genuine belief in your own capability. And what he found was that the most powerful source isn't encouragement from other people. It's not positive thinking. It's what he called mastery experience. Actually doing something hard repeatedly until your nervous system has evidence that you can do it. Not imagined evidence, like felt evidence. Done enough times, that repetition builds real belief. And then there's research on visualization and athletic performance. And what researchers have found around that is that when athletes vividly imagine themselves performing a movement, the brain doesn't treat that imagination as completely separate from the real thing. It knows you're not actually moving, but it still seems to use those mental rehearsals as a sort of practice, which is interesting because that's exactly what my visualization felt like. I wasn't physically running through the Siskiyou Mountains in my head, right? But every week I was mentally rehearsing what it would feel like to be the person who finished. So what was happening on my office floor was all three things working together. Ritual created the container, the repetition, the meaning, the intention. And inside that container, visualization was priming my brain. And the repetition itself was building what Bandura called mastery experience, right? Over and over until my nervous system had enough evidence to believe, right? So in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, but I think that's how the doubt disappeared. And I kind of believe that the ritual amplified everything else that I did because it was meaningful and intentional. And there was an element of transformation in it. And according to researchers Reynolds and Erickson, three things matter in ritual. First is identity. Who are you becoming? Not who are you right now, but who you're trying to be. And then second is purpose. Does this matter to you beyond just being practical, right? And third, autonomy. Are you choosing this? Are you choosing to do this? Right? When all three are present, a repeated behavior becomes a ritual. It becomes something more than just a practice. And this is where I did kind of start to get a little curious about my visualization. I wasn't just trying to reduce the anxiety I had about completing this goal. And I know that was a little unconventional way of reducing anxiety. I was enacting the identity of someone who could finish 100 miles, someone who could overcome doubt 3 times a week until my nervous system caught up, until my belief caught up, right? That's how repetition becomes transformation. You don't wait to feel like the person you're trying to be or the person you're trying to become. You act like her first, right? You repeat it, and eventually your brain believes it. Now, if you've seen my earlier video on return on joy, you know I've talked about how everyday rituals are things people are returning to right now. Small, sensory, embodied moments that signal safety. And there's a disclaimer here because I don't recommend my visualization per se for signaling safety. But in that video, in the video that I talked about rituals, I talked about how small brands and businesses can fit into some of those smaller moments and rituals. And this video really kind of explores that deeper layer of ritual, because what I've realized is that rituals aren't just coping tools. They're identity tools. They're belief and transformation tools. And I do believe that ritual can be used intentionally by businesses in their own customer experiences. So think of a barber who places a hot towel on a client's face, signaling the end of the experience, or a small retailer who walks a customer all the way to the door after the transaction. Most people would call those things value adds, better service, little extras, right? But the more I thought about it, the more I saw ritual in them, because a value add still feels a little transactional, right? A ritual is symbolic. It carries meaning. And the hot towel isn't really about the towel, right? Accompanying someone to the door isn't about showing them where the door is, right? Those behaviors are expressing something about how that business sees itself, how it sees its customers, and what kind of experience it's choosing to create for them. And just like my visualization ritual really wasn't making me physically stronger or more capable of running 100 miles, these rituals aren't making the product better or the service faster, right? They're reinforcing the identity of that business and that brand and the transformation they create for their customers. And maybe those small rituals businesses perform are helping people understand what kind of brand you are, like what you value and what you believe and why that matters. And as everything becomes more automated, right? And as AI handles more of what we used to do manually, the human-centered behavior, the ritual, right, feels more meaningful and important because it feels intentional and it feels human. And I think that's worth integrating in your own life and in your own business. So what rituals already exist in how you work or how you show up or how you open your doors or close them? Or are they intentional? Are they chosen? Because if ritual can rewire what we believe about ourselves, and I personally think it can, then it's probably doing something in your business. So that's it today, kids. If anything about this resonated, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. What rituals do you create for yourself or for your business? I'm super curious to know about it. So have a beautiful day, and I'll talk to you soon.